Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think we should go ahead and get started. It's just a few minutes after 1 o'clock Eastern Time or 10 o'clock my time. I'm in Arizona. Hopefully everybody can see my screen okay. I'm trying to show my PowerPoint slides. If for any reason you can't see my screen, you could try to send me a chat message. There should be a little chat on the side of your screen, a go-to webinar toolbar where you can send me messages. Just by way of introduction, my name is Yvonne Roberts. I work for AssistTech, and as you know, today we're going to be giving a brief presentation on our experience with patient-reported adverse events. I think it's a pretty interesting topic. We've gotten a lot of great feedback from our clients, and there's a lot of research surrounding this particular area, which we'll also present today. Just first want to get started by saying that the presentation, the actual slides themselves, I'm guessing will only take about 30 or 40 minutes to get through, and I'd like to leave ample time at the end to go through questions. That's my preference because I'd like to have plenty of time to answer everybody's questions. In the event that I don't, I will certainly follow up with everybody directly with their particular questions. And I hope you can hear me. I guess if you can, I'll never know. But okay, so and as far as the questions are concerned, like I just mentioned a few seconds ago, there should be a toolbar on your screen that says questions. You can just type the questions in there at any time, and I'll probably save them all for the end. All right, so our agenda today, first what we're going to do is talk about and look at some research, some published research that suggests the different problems associated with the typical AE reporting process that we see in our industry. We're going to give you some real-world examples of patient-reported AEs using eDiary technology. We're going to talk briefly about the importance or the value of integrating this data directly into the sponsor's database or EDC system. We're going to talk about some of the concerns that have been raised in this area, and then of course talk about the benefits, and as I mentioned, we'll save plenty of time for questions at the end. All right, so this first slide you see here is our typical adverse event reporting process. I know this is all very familiar to everybody on the call, but what usually is going to happen is that your subject is going to experience some type of symptom or undesirable symptom, we should say, when they're typically at home or not at the site. The patient then will visit their site at some period in time for their required site visit. And just for the sake of this presentation, we're going to say 30-day intervals. Now, sometimes the site visits are spaced longer apart, and I guess in rare cases they're shorter apart. There's a shorter duration between the site visits, but let's say typically the patient comes back to the site on day 30, and then they're asked to report any symptoms that they've been having. How are you feeling? Have you missed any days off of work or school? And so at that point, the patient is trying to report from memory not only the symptom themselves, but try to rate the severity of it, how it really impacted their day. At that point, the clinician then is responsible for actually documenting and interpreting the symptoms that the subject has reported. And so this is where the research is suggesting that maybe it would be better to actually try to correlate or have a collaboration, if you will, between the patient's version of their symptoms and the clinician's interpretation of the actual symptoms. Then, of course, the study coordinator has to abstract the data and put that into the ECRF, if you will. At that point in time, there might possibly another interpretation of symptoms, and then there's an entry into the database. So I'm sure for most people on the call that sounds pretty familiar with the way that your studies are running, and so we're going to talk briefly next about what are some potential issues with this type of process. So if you're familiar with a gentleman by the name of Ethan Bosch, he's very involved with research surrounding patient-reported adverse events, specifically with oncology type of studies. This particular research was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, I should mention that I have all of the sources for all of the data that we're presenting, and I would be more than happy to email them to anybody on the call if you'd like them, or we can publish them on our website, links to the actual sources if you'd like to review them yourselves or read the full articles. So I've abstracted some detail that is very relevant for our presentation today. So what we're looking at now is actually comparison of the patient and the clinician's version or of the symptoms. And so what you see here is the orangish color line is the patient's interpretation of their symptoms, and the blue is the clinician's interpretation of the subject's symptoms. And you can see in every case, whether it's fatigue, vomiting, constipation, etc., the clinician systematically or they consistently downgrade the symptoms compared to what the patient's version of the actual symptoms were. So now the question obviously is the patient maybe exaggerating their symptoms, and then in that case it's better to use the clinician's version anyways, because we would expect the clinician to hopefully be more accurate if this is the way that we're actually capturing the data in our studies. Well, the next slide is going to be pretty surprising, and we're going to see here that the patient's interpretation or description of their symptoms actually correlate better with the functional status. So what you see here on this particular chart is, again, the orange yellowish colored dots are the patient's version and the blue is the clinician. And as they approach 0.5 on the strength of concordance scale down there on the bottom is when they're actually most in line with the true functional status that the patient's experiencing. So not only is the clinician downgrading the event, but they're not actually in correlation or as close to correlation with the actual functional status of the subject. And so you can see that clinically they're able to measure the functional status of these things like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, etc. I personally am not a clinician, so I don't know how that's measured, but perhaps in these articles, if you'd like to read more or reach out to some of the researchers, you can we can certainly get you that information. But I think this data is pretty powerful, and it's part of the reason why the oncology teams are more embracing what's known as the CTC-AE scales, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But this research is what I think started a lot of teams down the path of embracing the patient reported AEs and having a collaboration, if you will, between the patient and clinicians version of the actual symptoms. All right, so this next slide suggests the way that we could be actually capturing patient-reported adverse events in real time. And so if you use the technology that's available to all of us now, the patient would experience their undesirable symptom. They'd be at home, they'd be at work, they'd be, sleeping and suddenly awakened, whatever it was. And at that particular time, they would be able to actually report the symptom on an electronic diary. And so for the purpose of this presentation, I'll probably refer to that as an untoward or undesirable event. That's what we're going to refer to the patient's version of their symptoms as. The benefit of this is obvious, right? There's not a memory lapse, so you're not waiting 30 days for the subject to come back to the site and try to remember how they felt, and maybe they remember it, or they have a less of a memory of the actual event, or maybe they forget altogether. And it's probably hard for them to articulate, oh, you know what, every day, an hour after I took my study medication, I had a headache. It's probably, but if you have that data captured electronically, it's easier to make those types of correlations. And then the system should then certainly notify the study coordinator, the investigator, electronically of the actual event that the subject had just reported. In that case, the study coordinator, the investigator, can then review remotely and make an assessment of the subject's untoward event and follow up if necessary. This would be obviously a paperless review and assessment. There would not, the subject's data would be delivered to the site electronically. They would be able to review it, make the necessary assessments, and follow up all via a web portal or a tablet themselves. And then, of course, the data is then available through in the sponsor's electronic database once that AE is truly defined. All right, so this next slide is just an example of the actual process that would go through. On the left side of the screen, you see a screenshot of an actual eDiary that's being used in a very large global clinical trial that captures the data from the subject. They would basically sign on to their diary and provide these fields. And now, of course, you can't see everything because there's a slight bit of scrolling down there, but essentially they're asking the patient to describe the actual untoward event or the symptom, the start time, the end time if it's not still ongoing, and the severity, and if it required the subject to take any con meds or medication to actually treat the event. Now all of that data is pushed then, or alerted to the study team and pushed into the EDC, and we'll talk about that process a little bit more as well. So just to kind of go through the bullets on the right, so the patient is going to obviously use the diary. They're going to have it with them hopefully at all times of the day, or at least more often they would be able to use that. And then of course they'd be able to go to the study site and report it in person to the study coordinator. The patient would report basic information. The expectation is that they would, as I said, be able to have a free text entry to describe the symptoms. A lot of people ask us, well, can you do a drop-down list? Can you have like predefined symptoms? And our answer to that is technically, sure, certainly any eDiary vendor could build in a drop-down menu or a pre-populated list of any sort of symptoms, but there's one obvious problem with that, and is that you would basically bias the subject, or potentially bias the subject into reporting AEs that they might not really be experiencing, or if you give them a sore throat as one of them, and they say, oh, you know what, my throat is hurting. I really came on here to report a headache, but now that I think about it, my throat's been itching for a few days. So that's the reason why we don't advocate for predefined lists, but that certainly would be up to the sponsor and something that we could discuss with the sponsor, but that's our position there. The questions that are patient-facing, if you will, should always be in a very patient-friendly language. A lot of times if you look at the clinician's case report form or source doc, it's got a lot of medical jargon in there that wouldn't be appropriate for the subject. And so what we recommend is the questions, the way that they're posed to the subject, would be a little bit more, I guess, easier to interpret or understand for the average patient or subject. So once the subject actually completes the patient-reported untoward event or undesirable event, the staff members again are notified via email or text messaging, or this is what we would expect to happen. And depending on the role in the study, the staff member would actually assess what we refer to as a potential AE. And so now the subject reported this untoward event, and so the clinician has to make the determination if that truly is an AE, if it's an adverse event that already exists and it's still just ongoing. So the clinician would be able to go into a web portal and assess the data that the subject reported and make their own clinical observations. Once the untoward event or undesirable event has actually been deemed as an adverse event, and has been assessed by the staff member, then that data at that point in time would be pushed into the study database. And the reason why we've recommended or designed the system in such a way is because this gives the study team an opportunity to clean the data, to assess the data, to answer the remaining CRF questions, if you will, that are not appropriate to the subject before that untoward event is actually pushed into the EDC system. So, for example, you probably wouldn't want to ask the subject if their untoward event is related to the investigational product. Okay, and so, but however, that of course is a question that you see on a standard AE CRF in most clinical trials. You want to know, hey, is this adverse event related, likely to be related to the actual study drug? And so there's several questions that would be required to be answered by the staff in addition to just determining the severity and comparing it to what the subject's interpretation of the severity is before it's being pushed to the EDC system. And then, of course, the system should, of course, track if the investigators actually signed off on the patient-reported event. This next slide just briefly goes over an example of why it's important to have the study coordinator kind of clean the data. So the subject, again, is going to type in their symptom in their own words. And so, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not a clinician, so these are my words here. It's probably not the best example, but let's say the subject reports an untoward event and they said that they were throwing up, and maybe the clinician needs to clean that data up and say, okay, the subject was really vomiting, and they would complete the remaining AE questions or the ECRF questions. And then at that point in time, as I mentioned, that data is then pushed into the sponsor database or EDC system. The other question that comes up a lot is how are the SAEs handled? So typically for our sponsors, they have their own SAE reporting process, whether it's through their EDC system or some other third-party vendor that handles the SAE reporting, and that all basically stays intact. And so what we're doing is we're on the front end capturing that data from the subject, making it available again to the clinician, and as far as SAE reporting is concerned, in our experience it's still being handled the same way as it would be if you were capturing this data in a typical way where the subject just comes to the site and reports their symptoms. So some considerations that sponsors should make if they are thinking about implementing this type of solution in a clinical trial. Again, I already mentioned that the patient version of the adverse event question should be patient-friendly terminology. The question should be simple. If you're running a global study, of course, the system should handle and allow the data to be entered in the subject's native language. And then, of course, there's going to be a translation process that happens on the back end that would put that particular data into English before it's pushed into the EDC system. I would suggest considering questions related to the relating essentially the AE to the study medication usage. And so the system should be designed to basically indicate or be able to track the relationship between when the study subject took their medication or their study medication and when these AEs, so you can see if there's any trends going on. Because now you're having this data in real time, so you can, in terms of building a safety profile, you can actually see these relationships more clearly. The system should allow the patient-reported adverse events to be linked to ConMeds, and of course also to link these AEs to days off work and school. So while the patient's actually reporting these symptoms, the system should naturally ask them if they took any medication, if they missed work or school, or if it disrupted any of their other daily activities. This next slide is just an overview of basically a system overview. This is an example of a study that we had supported or are supporting, and now, of course, it depends on the requirements for the study and what data you're capturing from the subject. But just to kind of give you an idea, the subject is expected to do things like answer ConMeds, non-drug therapies, infusion data, untoward events, PROs, and days off work and school, which is more, some people refer to this as a HRU, or health resource utilization type of form. So all of that data, as it's being captured, is then being pushed into a web portal, and this is where that site staff would have access to review and make the appropriate assessments and actually deem untoward events as adverse events. Another thing that might happen is the untoward events, the patient might report multiple untoward events for one AE, and so that data can also be cleaned up on the web portal. And then, of course, as we talked about earlier, that data then is pushed to the EDC system. And so the system has to be designed to handle that diary data and make certain fields editable by the site staff, and certain things like patient PROs like your SF36 and your EQ5Ds and other quality of life type of questionnaires as view only, so that the investigator still has access to this data, but that probably wouldn't be, of course, edited by the investigator like ConMed or AEs would be. This next slide is just an example of how the system data could flow. Now, of course, you have to make sure that these systems are synchronized. So if you do have the clinician updating a patient-reported AE, that data has to always be synchronized down to the tablet that the subject has, so that they're sharing the exact same data. And so the way that the SysTech is able to achieve this, and I'm sure many other vendors out there use similar technology, but the way that we achieve that is using 3G, 4G cellular communications to synchronize our tablet and portal through our database, and so everybody's looking at the same set of data. We've already talked about the fact that the patient-reported data is reviewed by the site staff before being pushed to the EDC, and so essentially when you view this type of data on a vendor's website, you should be able to see if the data has been assessed and if it's indeed been pushed to the EDC or to the sponsor database, or if more assessment is required. Now, the other thing we have here is the mapping, and of course, the system needs to be able to handle the actual mapping between the eDiary vendor's database and the sponsor database. So that's obvious step that has to happen, which SysTech has done in many different databases, including Oracle and Metadata Rave and different sponsor databases as well. So the next question is, what are some of the concerns? This all sounds great, so why wouldn't somebody choose to do this? Why wouldn't a sponsor? So the first concern is this really feasible? Will patients really report their AEs? Maybe they're not willing to or not able to. And so based on another study that was published several years ago in 2008, it was able to show that they were able to achieve on average a 92% adherence rate for patient-reported symptoms, and this was using an IVRS type of study. So subjects are certainly willing and able to report these types of symptoms. The next question is attrition, and so attrition meaning, basically over time that the subjects will stop or not report these types of symptoms at such a high rate, depending on how long the study is. So if you're running a study where the subject is expected to do this over a year or so, the sponsor is concerned about attrition. Will the subjects really buy into this and do this for that many weeks or months or maybe even years? And the graph that I have below, again, is it's not data that we collected, but it's data that's been published and many different articles, shows that there's a very insignificant amount of attrition, and this is actually in a study where the subjects were very sick and they were elderly as well. And so you can see over time the attrition, it varied, of course, in terms of their compliance, but they always maintained a very high level of compliance when completing these similar types of questions, and in this case it was an online questionnaire. All right, so the next slide is what are the benefits? Obviously, you're going to improve the quality of your safety data collection in any study. So from a sponsor point of view, the safety is number one, and of course from the regulatory point of view, that's a key component of any clinical trial. The compliance to actual medical standards using electronic notification. So what we're basically trying to imply by that is that using this type of technology allows the sites to comply to the medical standards because they're being notified of these types of events in real time. And so they will be essentially notified and reminded, hey, this is something that you need to follow up on, and there's a very clear indicator of where clinicians maybe still need to do some work on a particular untoward event or AE for a subject in terms of following up or assessing. The other thing is that it improves the clinical understanding and interpretation of the patient's experience with the actual study treatment. And lastly, the benefit would be to improve the patient's perception of their level of care and their perception to how much the sponsor really cares about or is interested in their undesirable events. And so now you're actually taking into consideration the patient's point of view and not just the clinician's point of view when you're recording these types of symptoms and events. Some of the other sponsor benefits would obviously finding out in real time. We already mentioned that on the previous slide. It's also important for drug developers to understand how well study medication is tolerated, especially if you're dealing, let's say, in an early phase type of study and you're working with your dosing. What could be better than actually having a system that's designed to capture those adverse events in real time right around your dosing intervals? And so I think it could be said that this would help the actual drug developers to understand how well their drugs are being tolerated. And then, of course, the combination or the collaboration, if you will, between the patient and the clinician in terms of their interpretation of symptoms and events would actually provide a more accurate assessment of the AEs for the sponsor and for the regulatory bodies. And I guess that was it. That was quick. I didn't realize I was going to be done that fast, but the session in terms of the slides are over, and I am going to quickly look at the questions that came in through the GoToWebinar, and we can go through those if everybody would like. So when you get a chance, I'll give everybody a few minutes to chime in with their questions. And I'm trying to get there right now. If you can hold on one second. And it looks like, I'm surprised, usually when we do these we have 30 or 40 questions, but I haven't gotten any yet, so maybe we can just hang tight and see if any other questions come in. And you don't have to be shy. I don't think anybody will be able to see your questions, but you can certainly ask them to me privately. Okay, so the next question is, how do you handle subject report of pre-existing medical history? And so that particular data would stay at the site. And so what, our company happens to have a system that we didn't talk about today that's used at the site to capture the data from the clinician's interview for the subject's medical history. This particular way that we've designed the system does not include the subject's medical history. So it's capturing the AEs that you would capture normally at the site. And so it would be the events that would happen after they've started dosing on their study medication, or after they've screened or been randomized into the study. So if a subject reported something that happened previously, then I'm not really sure exactly how the site would handle that in terms of reporting it. I'm sure it would be the same way they would handle it on paper if the subject came into the site and reported something that was more of a medical history and not necessarily something that was related to the study medication. And hopefully I answered that question okay. And if you can give me a second, I'm having a really hard time seeing the questions. I don't know why I'm having a little technical problem here. And let's see if I can figure this out. The next question is, are there web-based applications available? There's always concerns patients will lose their smartphone or tablet if we supply them with one. So this is one area we have quite a large amount of experience in terms of delivering hardware to subjects, and it's always a concern by the sponsor or by the CRO that the hardware will get lost. And I can tell you that we track that data very closely, and the loss rate or between clinicians or the subjects having hardware is less than 2%. So it's more of an anomaly than anything. And so you get, in our experience, you get much better compliance if you give the subject a piece of hardware that they can take with them and that they have access to at any given time of the day versus having them rely on the internet. Although the internet, of course, is more prolific and available to more and more of your subjects, you wouldn't want to be in a situation where they did not have access and they need to report something that was severe or very critical. And so there are web-based applications available, and in our experience it's probably not recommended for a phase 3 type of study, especially if you're doing standardized patient-reported outcomes, and we can get into that as well. It's kind of a whole separate topic, but in terms of hardware loss, I think you can expect less than 2%, and that's based on our numbers, which are in over 4,000 different devices that we've shipped over the years to subjects. Okay, the next question is, can the system integrate directly to an electronic CRF? And if not, how is that data integrated? So the answer to that is yes. The system does integrate directly to an electronic CRF. And so whether it's our version of the eCRF, meaning AssistText, or if you're using, let's say, Metadata Rave's eCRF. In the study that I had showed earlier, the sponsor is using Metadata Rave, and so what happens is the data from our portal, once the clinician cleans the data and makes the necessary updates, then that data is then pushed into Metadata Rave, where it's viewed as a view-only type of file. And so the data originates from our system and then is pushed into the EDC for viewing and reporting purposes. And in our experience, we typically handle all the integration on the back end, and so I'm sure different vendors would do things differently, but the way that AssistTech handles it is we have a team here that's very experienced in integrating with different databases, and so that's how the data is pushed into the eCRF. The next question is, do the sites follow up on each AE with the subject? You know, I don't have statistics on how often they follow up with the subjects, but the expectation is that yes, they basically have to address each patient-reported AE, or what our system calls an untoward event. They have to actually address each of those patient-reported symptoms before they get pushed to the EDC, and so they can pull reports, the sites can pull reports and see which untoward events have not been addressed or followed up by the site, and so, and of course the sponsor could pull that data as well. And so the expectation is yes, that they would, because essentially they're forced to in order for that data to be available in the EDC. Can you collect, the next question is, do you collect a separate field on the EDC that collects the subject's reported AEs? Now, the way that the system is designed right now and the way that the sponsors that we've worked with, they want to see in the EDC just the, if you will, clean data, the data that has the patient's original symptom, and after it's been updated by the clinician, they want that data actually pushed into the EDC. And so that's what we've done historically. Now, it doesn't mean we couldn't push the patient-reported data into the EDC, but so far the sponsors have requested that we push the clean data into the EDC, which is once the clinician has, again, determined the relationship to the study drug, maybe updated some of the terminology that the patient used to report the symptom, etc. They want to see that data actually in the EDC. But our system keeps all the data available for any type of reporting for the sponsor. The next question is, how does the data get source verified? And so this data that we're collecting is all electronic source, and so you don't actually have a paper source. Traditionally, when people talk about source data verification, they want to compare a paper version to an actual electronic version. So they're going to say, okay, does the paper version that was collected at the site match what somebody transcribed into the EDC? That's what source data verification historically is referred to. And in this case, you actually eliminate all that source data verification because now the source is being entered at the point of care, meaning the subject's data is actually the source data. And so it does not get source data verified because there's no paper to compare it to. And if the subject goes, and similarly, if the subject goes into the site and reports an adverse event, it would be entered directly into our system as well at the point of care, and that data as well would not need to be source data verified. And so eSource is a whole nother topic, and we've done some presentations on that. eSource is taking hold in our industry now because of the fact that it does not require source data verification if the data is actually being reported at the point of care and it's the original source, meaning comes straight from the patient's mouth. And so the patient says, hey, I have this symptom, it started on this day, and the clinician writes it directly into the electronic source file, then there's no reason to do source data verification. The next question is, how does the data manager query process work if the data is loaded into EDC? And so basically, there's two ways that can happen. The way that the metadata study that I mentioned earlier is happening is that they're still running their queries off of the metadata system. It sounds probably hard to believe, but they're running those queries that way, and then if they need to make changes, if a query does come up and there needs to be some update to the data, they'd have to actually go into our system and make that change. We're rolling out some studies now where the query management is being handled specifically just on our end, and so, but I don't have any kind of data for you on that just yet. So just to clarify, the queries are run on the EDC, and then if a data change needs to happen, let's say there was some type of data that didn't make sense, like it said that the subject had a headache, but somebody selected that the medication given was an antibiotic or something, which didn't make sense, and a query needed to be fired off. That data change would have to happen on our system. And then it would, of course, get pushed back into the EDC. The next question is a comment and a question. I see this as a great addition to the quality of data collected. Sponsors must be willing to pay for this, though. Of course, I agree. What is the impact of the additional cost to a typical study? And so, I can tell you that the cost hasn't been an issue for the sponsors that we've worked with, because the type of and the volume of data that we're capturing in a lot of these studies to do on paper and then have to do source data verification, on-site monitoring, runs them sometimes, upwards of millions of dollars. And so to deliver tablet solutions to the subjects or to the sites to capture this data at the point of care is so insignificant compared to the amount of money that they have to spend working through their different partners to transcribe the data, to source data, verify the data, to on-site monitor the data, etc. And so we're working with a lot of our clients on renegotiating some of those costs with their CROs, and also on revising the role of the monitor in terms of how they actually work in these types of studies. And so, if you would like to send me a sample protocol, I can certainly give you an idea of what the cost is, but I can't really just throw out a cost because it varies based on the number of sites, the number of subjects, the duration of the study, etc. The next question is, I was wondering how the subjects would deal with data capture of certain events only, say a grade 3 rather than all. So, the way that we've worked in the studies that we've worked on is that the subject is allowed to report any type of symptom, whether it's very mild and didn't impact their day, whether it's moderate or severe. And the other thing that we've had to implement is a description or a guide on how to determine if it's mild, moderate, or severe. And the sponsor has helped us with that, the sponsors that we've worked with, depending on what their requirements are. So we've never restricted a subject from entering only a specific type of event. They've always been able to enter any event, whether it's a headache or they fainted or something more severe. I don't know, but they've been able to, or something that require them to go to the emergency room. Let's say we've always allowed them to answer any event, and then the site, of course, decides how to deal with that. I'm sure with enough training, and if the system was designed to be very specific in terms of what types of AEs, if you wanted to restrict them to only certain grades of AEs, I'm sure the system, technically we could handle that, but I don't know how easy you would get them to be compliant in that way, the subjects. All right, I'm still scrolling through the questions. If the subject reports an AE that is pre-existing, can the site delete that untoward event? And so I think what you're asking is, if the subject reports a headache more than once and on accident, let's say, and they report multiple untoward events that have already been created as an adverse event, then the way that the system is designed is that the site would be able to link that untoward event to an existing adverse event and make an explanation on why they did that. So you would still maintain the subject's data and an explanation on why that was linked. The next question is, if the study coordinator or investigator has questions for the subject, can they contact the subject via the device, or is the device only for patient reporting? So the answer is they can contact the subject via phone. Obviously, they can call them. We do have one study where the sites are able to send messages down to the subject. It's not, however, it's not used as a two-way communication, meaning the investigator would ask them a question and then the subject would respond through the tablet. However, there's no real reason why we haven't done that, besides the fact that a sponsor mainly hasn't asked us to do that, or we just haven't gotten that far. But technology-wise, it's certainly doable. And so if that would be something that you'd be interested in, then or a study, if you had a study that you think that would fit, we could certainly technology-wise accomplish that. But for now, there's messages that are being sent down to the device, like reminding the subject of their appointments and that sort of thing. But there's not a two-way communication through the device itself, besides the predefined questions about the AEs and ConMeds, etc. The next question is the information entered by the patient saved after it is cleaned, and can this be reviewed against the clean data by the sponsor? And the answer is yes, it can be reviewed against the clean data by the sponsor. So all of that data is still maintained as part of the audit trail. And so you would see, for example, the original data that was reported by the subject. I gave the example of the subject reporting that they threw up and the study coordinator changing it to vomit. That's a terrible example. I need to think of something else. But anyways, the audit trail would include any of those changes. Likewise, if the subject reported as a mild, and after the clinician reviewed with the subject and had a conversation with the subject and they thought that it should be deemed as moderate or whatever the grading is for that particular study, that would be included in the audit trail, as well as an explanation on why the grading between the subject and the clinician were differing. Okay, I'm still scrolling through questions. What are the controls for the PI to clean the data? And so basically the investigator is able to go in, for example, and change any of the fields. And so if like I said, if they need to change the description, they need to change the severity, they would be able to do that, but they would have to indicate for the audit trail purposes why they made a change to the data. It's basically the same as paper, but the exception is that the system forces the user to make an explanation on why they made that change. So, for example, if they had to change the ConMed, maybe the subject reported that they took Tylenol, but after the subject came to the site and talked to the investigator, they realized they really were taking ibuprofen, and they need to make that type of change. They can do that through our portal with an explanation. So we don't limit the investigator or the study coordinator from doing their job per se, but we just make sure that the audit trail includes all those details. And the last question is, I think it's the last one, will the slides be posted or sent out for attendees? And the answer is yes. I will send the slides to all of the attendees, and I will try to follow up. For some reason, when I am trying to look at the questions that are being asked, I have a little tiny screen to look at them, so I might be missing some. So I apologize if I missed your question. So at the end of the session, I'll be able to pull a report that has all the questions, and I'll follow up with you individually about the questions, and I'll also send the slides out to everybody that's on the call. And similarly, we will probably publish a recording of the actual webinar. If you'd like to share that with your colleagues, we can do that as well. And I'm just doing one more click through if there's any other questions. Would you anticipate issues with a perception of over-reporting of AEs? And some of my colleagues here at AssistTech have had conversations with some people on the FDA side, and basically the consensus is if you are actually indeed capturing these data from the subjects, the FDA would take that into consideration and understand why maybe in two different studies, if one you are collecting the AEs only at the site and the other one you are collecting them from the subjects in real time, that you might have a higher volume of data, but the FDA certainly understands and would take that into consideration. So we haven't had in any of our studies any issues with that. And so I can only tell you from our experience that we haven't had any negative feedback from the sponsors or from the FDA on perception of one study having more AEs over another because of the fact that the subjects are actually reporting them. I think the FDA would probably agree that they like to have the actual higher quality of data just from a safety standpoint. And I believe that's it. That's all the questions I can see, and I apologize if I missed. It certainly was not intentional. And I will, again, review all the questions and follow up with everybody individually. And thank you very much for joining. I hope you found it useful. And it seems like we had quite a few people on the call, and so I will be certain to follow up by email with a copy of the slides, and I encourage you to certainly reach out to me. My phone number, hopefully you can see on the screen. If not, let me see. It says that I'm pausing showing my screen. I don't know why it's pausing, but anyways, my let me see if I can. Oh, now I paused it. Oh. Sorry, I apologize if I'm confusing you, but in any case, I'm trying to show you my email address, yvonne.roberts@assisttech.com. I guess you all probably have that from signing up from the webinar, and then my phone number is on there as well. You feel free to reach out to me, 480-874-9400, and I'm at extension 336. And so I will follow up with everybody over the next week or so. And again, thank you very much for joining. I really appreciate it.